He commanded armies that broke an empire, yet slept on the dirt with a saddle for a pillow. This is Abu Ubaidah, the gentle general of Syria whose humility steered conquest, whose choices changed faith and empire, and whose death would test a civilization's soul. Caliph Umar stood beneath the shade of an awning, gazing northward toward the lands of Syria. The parchment maps fluttered in the breeze, but his thoughts were elsewhere. In a moment recalled by the earliest chroniclers, he turned to those near him and whispered, "If only Abu Ubaidah were here." That single sentence carries the weight of an era. It was not about military tactics or political advice. It was something deeper, longing for a man whose presence had come to symbolize clarity, humility, and moral equilibrium in a time of rapid change. To understand the Muslim world's transformation under the early caliphate, one must understand Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. He was born in Mecca into the distinguished Quraysh tribe, a people fiercely proud of their lineage, customs, and social order. In that highly stratified society, Abu Ubaidah's early reputation was not one of wealth or political dominance, but a simpler, more rare virtue honesty. He was known from his youth for his calm demeanor and moral uprightness. He was a man. Others entrusted with their business, their disputes, and their silence. When Islam emerged in Mecca, it posed a serious threat to the Quraysh's way of life. Conversion often meant instant alienation. And yet, when his close friend Abu Bakr approached him with a message of Prophet Muhammad, Abu Ubaidah offered no grand speech, no hesitation, he simply accepted. One of the earliest Muslims, he stood firm through the initial waves of persecution. He lived through ostracization, boycotts, slander, and even violent encounters. And he never wavered. He would later be among the small and honored group known as the Ashara Mubashashara, the 10 companions to whom the Prophet promised paradise in their lifetime. That alone solidified his spiritual legacy. But what set Abu Ubaidah apart even among the elite companions was a title few received: Amin al-Umma, the trustworthy of the Ummah. The Prophet gave him this title in unmistakable terms. Whenever there was a situation requiring deep trust, calm resolution, and absolute moral clarity, it was Abu Ubaidah who was given charge. He led not with authority, but with conscience. The test of one's convictions, however, comes not in peaceful moments, but under pressure. And no moment pressured the tiny Muslim community like the Battle of Badr in the year 624 CE. Just 2 years after the Hijra from Mecca to Medina, the Muslim army, barely 300 men, faced a Qurashi force 3 times its size. Among the Qurashi ranks were men the Muslims once called brothers, fathers, and friends. Fighting in Badr that day was Abu Ubaidah's own father, in one of the most difficult decisions of his life. Abu Ubaidah found himself face to face with the man who had raised him. As narrated in historical reports, his father approached him multiple times in battle, intent on killing him. Abu Ubaidah tried to avoid the inevitable, but when cornered, he made the choice. He raised his sword, struck, and walked away changed. That wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a reflection of how deeply he had internalized the principles of Tawhid, the belief in the oneness of God. Faith was not a theoretical idea for Abu Ubaidah. It was everything, even when it cost him something as personal and profound as his bloodline. Another opportunity to see Abu Ubaidah's character came at the Battle of Uhud. In that chaotic, bloody fight, the Muslims initially held the upper hand, but due to a fatal misunderstanding, their ranks were broken and panic spread. The Prophet Muhammad himself was injured. Arrows had struck his face, and armor rings became lodged in his flesh. In that moment, as many fled in confusion and fear, Abu Ubaidah pressed forward. With immense care and anguish, he began removing the metal rings from the prophet's face, doing so with his own teeth until his mouth bled. He didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He merely acted out of deep love and unwavering loyalty. Scenes like these became the fabric of Abu Ubaidah's reputation. He was brave, but his bravery didn't roar. It stood still, firm, and resolute. When the Prophet passed away in 632 CE, the Muslim community reeled. New questions replaced old ones. Who would lead? The issue of succession was not just political, it was existential. In that crucial moment, some among the Ansar put forward Abu Ubaidah as a possible candidate to lead the Ummah. His reply was characteristic of the man. He deflected attention from himself and supported Abu Bakr, reinforcing unity over ambition. He wanted power that may have been his moment. But Abu Ubaidah was never interested in robes or thrones. His compass pointed in one direction, only to serve, even under growing responsibility. Abu Ubaidah retained the same ascetic lifestyle. When later placed in military command, he refused upgrades. His belongings remained minimal: a water skin, a saddle that doubled as a pillow, and a patched cloak. These were not symbols of poverty. They were statements of principle. In one instance, when appointed to lead a military expedition into Syria, Abu Ubaidah's leadership came into contact with Khalid ibn al-Walid, the incomparable tactician of Muslim history. The contrast between the two commanders was striking. Khalid was bold, commanding, and decisive. Abu Ubaidah was soft-spoken, patient, and measured. But they respected and complemented each other. When Caliph Umar eventually reassigned overall command of the Syrian campaign from Khalid to Abu Ubaidah, it was not announced immediately. Some reports suggest that Abu Ubaidah kept the letter of command hidden until after a pivotal battle, fearing that untimely news of a leadership change might demoralize the troops or create unnecessary friction. Only a man with such complete control over his ego could have done that years later. During a tour of Syria, Caliph Umar visited him. When asked to stay the night in Abu Ubaidah's home, Umar was shocked to find a virtually empty room. There were no carpets, furniture, or ornaments. Just the water skin, a saddle, and a few dishes. The Caliph wept. He looked at his companion and said, "The world has changed us, all except you, Abu Ubaidah." Here was a man trusted with vast new territories, cities, and peoples, all under Muslim rule, and yet nothing of the world touched him. As the circle of conquest widened from Arabia to the Roman provinces in Syria, Abu Ubaidah became a key figure not only in winning battles, but in setting the tone for how the new Islamic State would engage with foreign populations. He viewed conquest not as domination, but as stewardship. Civilians were not to be terrorized, but protected. Property was not to be looted, but documented and preserved. Agreements were to be honored not as strategy, but as sacred trust. And woven through it all was his unbearable simplicity, his unchanging morality, his refusal to elevate himself, even when the world around him begged to place him on a pedestal. Abu Ubaidah was often placed in command, but he never acted like a commander. He issued orders like requests. He received fame like a man dodging rain. He embodied a rare kind of leadership, one that shuns power even as it holds it. His possessions, humble as they were, serve here as recurring symbols. The water skin that nourished his body, the saddle that carried him across empires and cradled his head in sleep, the patched cloak that withstood the wind while his conscience carried the burden of conquest. In the dramatic, chaotic, and often glorious history of early Islam, it is common to remember the warriors, the scholars, the rulers. But in Abu Ubaidah, Ibn al-Jarrah, we see something rarer, not the loudest voice, not the sharpest sword, but the truest heart. And so we ask, what happens when humility sits atop a warhorse? How does a man who fears status lead men who crave triumph? Can a quiet soul leave a loud echo across time? The next chapters in Abu Ubaidah's life will provide the answers etched in treaties, in battles, in choices made far from glory. But for now, we leave him under the Syrian sky, where the winds carry stories of men who quietly shaped civilizations, and did so without needing a single monument of stone. In the year 632 CE, history shifted. The Prophet Muhammad passed away in Medina. News spread like a storm. The streets fell silent. Grown men collapsed. Companions grieved as though the very soul of the world had disappeared. In the masjid, Umar ibn al-Khattab stood trembling, refusing to believe the Prophet had died. "By God," he shouted, "Muhammad has not died. He has only gone to meet his Lord, like Moses did before." But one voice cut through the grief, calm and measured. Abu Bakr al-Siddiq stood before the crowd and reminded them of a simple truth. Whoever worshipped Muhammad, know that Muhammad has died. But whoever worships Allah, then Allah is ever living and never dies. Medina gathered itself around those words. The first crisis of succession, the first crack in what might break a lesser nation, was steadied by clarity, conviction, and leadership. Abu Bakr was entrusted with the caliphate, but the challenges before him were immense. The Arabian Peninsula did not breathe easy after the Prophet's death. Almost at once, tribes began to splinter. Some refused to pay zakat. Others declared new prophets. Still others interpreted the Prophet's death as an end to their allegiance entirely. What followed was a series of interconnected rebellions known collectively as the Ridda Wars, the Wars of Apostasy. Throughout this campaign, to reassert unity, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah remained by Abu Bakr's side, serving both as moral compass and military officer when needed. The Ridda Wars were brutal, but they accomplished the consolidation of Arabia under a single political and spiritual banner once again. But then came the pivotal question. Now that Arabia was united, what next? Should the young state defend its borders, or should it expand? For many, including Abu Bakr, the answer lay in securing the fragile, dangerous edge of the north. Because north did not mean just desert tribes and border skirmishes. It meant empire civilizations that had stood tall for centuries. To the northeast, the Sassanid Persian Empire, still formidable but exhausted from generations of warfare. To the west, the Byzantine Empire, rich but divided, ruling Syria as a distant, brittle province. In that time, Syria, Greater Syria to be precise, was not a monolith. It was a vast mosaic of garrisons, monasteries, Greek-speaking bishops, Syriac farmers, and semi-autonomous tribal federations. Byzantine administration was heavy-handed and unpopular in some rural quarters. Local populations were weary of taxes, conscription, and theological disputes imposed from Constantinople. For the young Muslim state, this region carried enormous strategic importance. Not only did it present a buffer between hostile foreign powers and the Arabian heartland, but it also controlled ancient trade. Arteries routes stretching from Baghdad to Damascus to Jerusalem and beyond. Abu Bakr understood this deeply. So, in a move that would permanently alter the shape of history, he ordered the dispatch of 4 armies toward Syria in 633 CE. Each had specific directions. Amr ibn al-As was assigned to Palestine. Shurabil ibn Hassana took the Jordan region. Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan advanced toward Damascus, and Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah was given the northern interior toward Homs, also known in Roman times as Emesa. This wasn't a reckless raid. It was a highly disciplined maneuver, prefaced by a code of engagement rooted in Islamic ethics. Every army was instructed to first send letters, not swords. The citizens and rulers of these territories were to be offered three choices: accept Islam and become equal members of the community; refuse Islam but agree to pay jizya, a tax, in exchange for protection; or, if both were refused, face military confrontation. This code made one thing clear: this expansion was not born from greed or rage, but from a combination of strategic necessity, religious mission, and political pragmatism. As the armies moved north, they faced a harsh reality. The Syrian frontier was no wilderness. It was dotted with fortified towns, seasoned garrisons, and rugged terrain. The climate was unfamiliar. Rain fell frequently. The cold didn't relent at night. Ancient road systems wound through valleys and ravines, making movement heavy and exposing troops to ambush if not careful. In these early days, the military campaign was not defined by great battles, but by small skirmishes, shifting alliances, and hard decisions. Small towns were approached. First, those who accepted terms became part of the expanding network of sanctuary and order. Others resisted and were fought quickly, often decisively. But the true complexity of the campaign lay not just in the battlefield. It lived in the conversations. Beside the fires at night, between commanders and soldiers, between seasoned veterans of the Arabian Wars and fresh recruits seeing Roman roads and cathedrals for the first time, some asked, "Are we conquerors now?" Others wondered, "If these people do not fight us, have we fulfilled our duty?" Still others worried, "What if wealth changes us before we realize it?" Abu Ubaidah was a still point in this swirling uncertainty. Gentle in tone, sharp in mind, unwavering in principle, he reminded his men that the goal was not the taking of cities, but the establishment of justice. That they were not to plunder, but to protect. That they were not marching for spoils, but for God. There were times when morale dipped, and cities seemed impenetrable, and long supply lines weighed down the advance. And yet, reports from the northern front, under Abu Ubaidah's leadership, remained steady. He was slow in speech and deliberate in decision, but when a choice was made, it came with a clarity that steadied everyone around him. It was around this time, in late 633 or early 634, that messengers arrived bearing news that would swing the pendulum of the Syrian campaign. The Byzantines were regrouping. Reinforcements were coming larger than anticipated. A coordinated response from the empire was imminent. And the Muslim contingents were still scattered, each commander responsible for a different frontier. The tension rose, but then word arrived from the opposite side of the Arabian Syriac. There, a commander whose name already carried the weight of legend was cutting through the Persian heartlands with shocking speed. A man who once brought the Muslims to victory at Mu'tah and decisively at Yamamah. A general who rode with the fury of a storm and the precision of a surgeon. Khalid ibn al-Walid, with lightning force. He turned from Iraq toward the Syrian front, not by the conventional route, but by a perilous march across the desert, cutting across oceans of sand rarely traversed by organized armies, hauling troops, water, and faith toward the heart of the Byzantine-controlled Levant. The commanders in Syria Yazid, Shurabil, and Abu Ubaidah received the news with mixed feelings. Help was on the way. But so was a general whose very presence would shift the balance of leadership. No one anticipated what Khalid would do next. His arrival would not just bring military muscle, it would shake the entire structure of the Syrian campaign and force decisions on unity, command, and pride. Abu Ubaidah, known for his humility and foresight, would need to navigate this carefully. Would he step aside, share power, assert control? The man of silence was about to be placed next to a man of thunder, and together, they would alter not only Syria, but the destiny of empires. The full confrontation with Byzantium was drawing near, and the landscape was shifting fast. The battles ahead would be bloodier, the decisions heavier. The stakes, civilization. But in this quiet before the storm, we find a rare moment of reflection. A pious army at the edge of an empire, a caliph watching from Medina, and two commanders, about to share a battlefield written into history forever. The desert. For now, we still. But the storm was coming, and it had a name. Khalid ibn al-Walid, between sword and conscience. The Khalid Abu Ubaidah paradox. The desert was vast. The wind dry and sharp. Each breath pulled water from the lungs, and the sun pressed downward like an iron weight. But somewhere in that harsh emptiness, across hundreds of miles of barren Tirana storm was gathering not of dust, but of destiny. Leading it was a man already spoken of in hushed Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, marching not just with his army, but with the very momentum of empire at his back. From Iraq to Syria, Khalid led one of the most daring maneuvers. In early Islamic military history, the infamous Thirsty March, crossing the Syrian desert through a virtually waterless path. It was a feat few even attempted, one no army was expected to survive. But Khalid was not merely a general, he was a force of nature with a spine of steel and a heart trained by war. Every one of his campaigns was a study in how decisive will could be weaponized. The march tightened his troops into hardened fighters, bonded not by convenience, but shared hardship. When Khalid's forces emerged from the desert and met the existing Muslim garrisons in Syria, the energy shifted instantly. Morale surged. Veteran commanders like Amr ibn Alas, Shurabel ibn Hassana, and Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan received him with relief. Reinforcements had arrived. But it was Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, the quiet moral leader of the Syrian campaign, who was now brought face to face with his opposite. Two different archetypes stood side by side: Khalid, the bold tactician whose battlefield decisions electrified armies and terrified empires; Abu Ubaidah, the soft-spoken commander who moved with patience and principle, whose strength was not in flurries of violence, but an unwavering restrained power guided by conscience. It would have been easy for tension to arise between them. Khalid carried a towering reputation from his victories at Muta, Yamama, and Ain Altima. Many considered him the most capable military leader among the companions. And yet, Abu Ubaidah had his own kind of gravity, not loud, but deeply felt. His peers respected his unshakable sense of justice. His troops admired his fairness. Prophet himself had praised him as the trustworthy of this Ummah. If Khalid inspired movement, Abu Ubaidah inspired moral clarity. And yet, what followed was not rivalry but deep, enduring mutual respect. Khalid, though known for his strength, deferred to Abu Ubaidah's spiritual leadership without resistance. Abu Ubaidah, despite his higher religious standing and rank among the early converts, recognized Khalid's unmatched battlefield intelligence and gave him full operational control in the field. There was no ego, no power struggle, just service. To the same purpose, the expansion of justice and the truth in a land. Ruled by weary empire, but uncertainty loomed from Medina. Umar ibn al-Khattab watched events unfold with concern. A wise and far-sighted leader, he recognized the delicate balance needed in the Syrian campaign. Sources differ on the exact timing, but during this phase of the campaign, likely just before or around the Battle of Yarmouk, Umar made a bold decision. He sent a secret message to Abu Ubaidah. Khalid ibn al-Walid was to be relieved of supreme command. Abu Ubaidah was to take his place as overall commander of the armies in Syria. It was a political and psychological decision. Umar feared that the Ummah's military victories might dangerously concentrate loyalty around fading personalities and rising egos. Khalid, though immensely effective, had begun to attract a cult-like admiration for a caliph pursuing justice and accountability. That was a signal flashing red. Abu Ubaidah was the antidote man who would never misuse power, who carried authority like a burden, not a crown. According to some reports, when the letter arrived, Abu Ubaidah did not announce it immediately. A major campaign had just begun. To reveal a sudden shift in leadership, to risk demoralizing the troops or disrupting cohesion, would have been dangerous. So Abu Ubaidah held the letter in silence, waiting, watching, commanding through Khalid, even as he became commander-name. Himself, it wasn't cowardice. It was wisdom, knowing that right actions must often wait for the right moment. Only after the military danger passed did Abu Ubaidah quietly inform Khalid of the change. When he did, the environment remained calm, stable, and respectful. And, in a testament to both men, Khalid accepted the change without revolt or resentment. He continued to command the cavalry and field movements. Abu Ubaidah coordinated overall strategy, logistics, and political affairs. There are few moments in history where high-stakes leadership transitions go so smoothly. Each man could have made other choices. Khalid could have disobeyed. Abu Ubaidah could have imposed dominance. But both deferred for something beyond themselves. That act by Abu Ubaidah concealing the letter until the time was right became a defining moment in how history remembers him. A declaration not in words, but in restraint. It was leadership. Without pride, strategy, without selfishness. And perhaps most rare of all, humility that empowered, rather than undermined, strength in many ways. Abu Ubaidah's quiet elevation to supreme command reflects his entire life. Man who led without clamor, who rose without asking, and who influenced without forcing. When others pursued influence, he pursued accountability. And when the time came for him to take full control of the Syrian campaign, he did so with the same grace and patience that had always defined him, even after becoming the senior-most commander. Abu Ubaidah chose not to sideline Khalid. He understood. That greatness did not diminish when shared. In fact, it often grew. Khalid remained the field commander, leading raids, flanking maneuvers, and tactical strikes. Abu Ubaidah coordinated the larger picture, dealing with non-Muslim populations, managing political terms, and keeping his forces morally grounded. Two different strengths functioning in tandem, mind and might, conscience and courage. What could have been a divisive episode became a lesson in how leaders build harmony without compromising conviction. Abu Ubaidah never viewed leadership as dominance. He viewed it as a form of service, a task to be fulfilled and then surrendered when the duty was done. He placed the needs of the army, the morale of his men, and the unity of the mission above his own title. It was a rare kind of wisdom, not the wisdom to command, but the wisdom to not always use that command. This balance of personalities, Khalid's fearless, Aggression complemented by Abu Ubaidah's calm, sobriety proved essential in the face of escalating threats. Because beyond the victories and political shifts, an even greater storm was gathering to in Constantinople sat Heraclius, emperor of the Byzantine Empire. A scholar warrior and seasoned diplomat, Heraclius understood that Arabia had become something far more dangerous than anyone in the imperial class had anticipated. These weren't mere raiders. These weren't hungry nomads. These were cohesive political units, bound by a code, driven by belief, and led by men the likes of which Rome had not seen in centuries. Heraclius gathered his remaining strength. By land and by sea, reinforcements came from Armenia, from Asia Minor, even from Ghassanid Arab allies still loyal to Byzantium. What was now being prepared was no longer a reactive force, was a grand counteroffensive, something designed not just to halt the Muslim advance, but to roll it back entirely. Abu Ubaidah sensed the scale of what was coming. He received reports of Byzantine units assembling, of conscripted militias being trained, of fortified positions being reinforced from Palestine to the Orontes River. He knew that if a single great battle were to decide the future of Syria, it would not be far off. Within the Muslim armies, the tension was palpable. The incoming Byzantine force would outnumber them by tens of thousands. But numbers, as Khalid often said, were not the final arbiter of victory. Faith, positioning, unity, and timing would matter just as much, if not more, in this atmosphere. A small but profound moment passed between Abu Ubaidah and Khalid. According to some reports, they sat under a small tent in the evening before a critical decision point. Maps lay on the ground. Fire cracked softly nearby. One of them said, "Victory is a trust, not a trophy." That line, short and piercing, echoed the entire philosophy of Abu Ubaidah's leadership. He never saw success as a personal accolade. He saw it as a responsibility, a burden handed down by God, to be carried carefully, humbly, and with the knowledge that one day it would be lifted away. This outlook shaped every decision Abu Ubaidah made in the lead-up to the greatest test of his military life. As movements began around the Golan Heights and the plains of South Syria, the armies slowly repositioned themselves toward a site that would become legendary, the fields of Yarmouk. The Byzantine army was assembling rapidly, powerful and multi-ethnic. In composition, Armenians, Slavs, Greeks, Christian Arabs, and Syrian auxiliaries filled its ranks. They came with catapults, cavalry divisions, trained infantry, and the blessings of Heraclius himself. In contrast, the Muslim forces were smaller, but leaner, seasoned by mobile warfare, experts in desert maneuvering, adaptable under pressure, and held together not by imperial demand, but shared intent. As both sides approached the edge of collision, Abu Ubaidah finalized his command decisions. He retained Khalid as the cavalry commander. He placed men like Shurabel, Ikrimah, and Yazid at key positions along the lines. Every officer knew their role. Every message came with clarity. Abu Ubaidah did not pace with anxiety. He prayed. He didn't spend the night inspecting troops endlessly. He walked quietly between tents, offering calm words and brief reassurances. He didn't promise victory. He promised honest effort. He didn't stoke hatred of the enemy. He reminded his men to fight with discipline, to remember the ethical code that began every campaign: not to kill non-combatants, not to destroy for spectacle, not to stain the very faith they were representing as dawn neared. Those who had doubted quiet leadership began to understand why Abu Bakr trusted him, why Umar appointed him, why the Prophet titled him Amin Ulama. Not. Every great general shouts from the front. Some stand at the center, not to be seen, but to keep others standing. The paradox of Khalid and Abu Ubaidah in consciences, not just a lesson in military history. It is a blueprint for leadership in its most complex form. Their contrasting styles did not fracture, they intertwined. Together, they built a force greater than just the sum of swords. It was the embodiment of balance itself. What lay ahead was the most defining battle in the Islamic conquest of the Levant, one that would redraw borders, shift civilizations, and mark the twilight of Byzantine power in Syria. Everything Abu Ubaidah and Khalid had stood for would now be tested. Not just their tactics, but their souls, their scars, and their reasons. For fighting Yarmouk was no longer a place. It was a storm on the horizon, a horizon now lit out by sunrise, but by war. Damascus, 2 doors, 1 decision. Damascus, the jewel of Syria, stood nearly impregnable. High walls brushed the sky. Roman architecture crowned the skyline. Gates 7 in all were fortified, patrolled, and supplied. Behind those gates were monks, bishops, soldiers, merchants, women, children, and the weight of Byzantine. Civilization stretched thin, but still proud. This was no outpost. It was a city of knowledge and wealth, a regional capital of immense strategic value. For the Muslim armies, it represented not just a military target, but a political turning point. If Damascus fell, the rest of Syria would begin to unravel. If it stood, the arm of Byzantium might yet hold fast. The siege began, and it did not pass quickly. For several months, the Muslims surrounded the city on all sides. The encirclement was methodical and suffocating. Scouts reported every movement from within the walls. Supplies dwindled. Sorties were repelled. Negotiations started and stalled again and again. There were moments where the tide threatened to turn. Offerings of money, questions about surrender, feints from the garrison, but Damascus held out defiantly. Inside, the population began to fragment. The bishop of the city, a man caught between theological schisms and military pragmatism, weighed his options carefully. The Christian clergy leaned toward peace. Their concerns were not political, but spiritual, preserving places of worship, avoiding massacres, preventing chaos. Meanwhile, the military garrison waited desperately for reinforcements. Spies and whispers told them that Heraclius was mustering troops further north, but the promised aid never arrived. Abu Ubaidah maintained the blockade with patience, rotating positions, keeping morale intact. At no point did his forces indiscriminately bombard the city. There was structure to the siege, rules. Even in trying conditions, Abu Ubaidah's command reminded his troops to avoid destruction for destruction's sake. He operated not with an iron fist, but with the slow pressure of inevitability. Then came the turning point, the event that would become one of the most debated and symbolically rich moments in the conquest of Syria: the double entry of Damascus. On one side of the city, at the eastern gate, Khalid ibn al-Walid decided that negotiations had taken too long. Using his usual blend of strategic audacity and combat expertise, he executed a fast and aggressive nighttime assault. His forces breached. The gate overpowered the defenders and began pouring into the city quarters by force. It was a breathtaking gamble, timed perfectly and executed with precision. But at the very same time, elsewhere along the city's perimeter, a delegation from the clergy successfully completed a negotiated surrender with Abu Ubaidah. The bishop offered terms. The people would pay the agreed jizya tax. Churches would be protected, and the gates would open peacefully. Abu Ubaidah accepted. Now, two events, one militaristic, one diplomatic, collided in the heart of the city. Inside Damascus, chaos teetered with possibility. On one block, Khalid's troops entered as victors in combat. On another, Abu Ubaidah's terms of peace were being honored. The city risked spiraling into confusion. Would the rules of war apply? Would the right to plunder, granted by conquest, override the sanctity of the treaty now signed? The crucial command decision came down to one man Abu Ubaidah. Despite Khalid's victory by force, Abu Ubaidah ordered that the treaty terms prevail. He acknowledged the simultaneity of events, but insisted that fairness, not fury, would define the Muslim army. The city would not be sacked. Civilians would not be punished. The rules of engagement, as set by divine instruction and prophetic guidance, remained firm. Justice, even in the moment of triumph. Khalid disagreed at first. He argued, with reason, that military conquest entitled the army to the legal spoils of war. But he did not disobey. Once Abu Ubaidah had made his decision, Khalid conceded. That moment once again reflected the unique chemistry between the two commanders' Khalids, the lion of the battlefield, submitting to the conscience of a man who would rather win hearts than treasure. By sparing Damascus, Abu Ubaidah sent a message not just to the residents of the city, but to all of Syria. This conquest was not vengeance, it was vision. Military power could take a city, but only discipline and justice could hold it. And it worked, rather than sparking greater rebellion. Damascus became a living example of coexistence. Churches remained standing. Markets resumed trading. The resident population was not expelled, but integrated. Abu Ubaidah established order not through bloodshed, but through diplomacy, negotiation, and firmness. The first tax registers were drawn up, community leaders were consulted. People, suspicious at first, began to see the new rule not as an apocalypse, but as a shift, and many adapted with surprising speed. What could have been a scene of terror became a study in restraint. The capture of Damascus marked more than a territorial achievement. It shifted the psychological balance of the entire Syrian campaign. Until then, Byzantine garrisons still believed in Rome's return. That belief died, in part, with the peaceful entry into Damascus. The people saw a different kind of conqueror. Abu Ubaidah did not impose new gods or destroy sacred institutions. He outlined public terms, protected civilians, and offered stability in an otherwise collapsing frontier. His decision not to sack the city, even when within his right, became a powerful moment of credibility. The residents, from Jewish merchants to Christian monks, now had a precedent. This new authority honored its word. Markets reopened within days. Farmers returned to fields outside the walls. The Church of St. John, the eventual site that would later become the Umayyad Mosque, remained untouched. The jizya tax was levied according to carefully implemented rates, and in exchange, Abu Ubaidah guaranteed full protection of life, property, and worship. For many, fears of cultural and religious erasure began to subside. What they experienced instead was a transition not into servitude, but into administrative integration. A deeper transformation occurred, as well perception. Within months, tribal leaders throughout neighboring towns began sending envoys to the Muslim camp seeking terms, not war. Some Byzantine allies, disenchanted with Constantinople's distant and overbearing rule, even opened negotiations for local surrender. The conquest of Damascus, executed with principle and not brutality, sowed a kind of influence that warfare alone could not achieve. This was no horde pillaging the north. These were organized armies run by people whose law was as structured as their prayer times. But even within Islamic sources, the story of Damascus brings controversy. Some classical historians like Al-Waqidi and Saif bin Umar present varying accounts of the city's surrender, while many traditions place the siege of Damascus before the Battle of Yarmouk. A smaller but significant scholarly view puts its final conquest afterward. The discrepancies come from differing hadith chains, battle reports, and perhaps retrospective sequencing by early chroniclers trying to fit numerous events into a coherent timeline. However, framing these differences matters. Rather than getting buried in technicalities, historians remind us that such inconsistencies are common in early medieval historiography. What matters more is consensus on the outcome, tone, and consequence of the event. And here, almost all sources agree. Abu Ubaidah's handling of Damascus became the defining symbol of Islamic just war ethics in Syria. Beyond the politics, though, were the moments that defined the human experience of conquest complex, difficult, but real. As soldiers entered the city, many residents faced impossible choices. Some families fled, hoping to reach Byzantine territories further north. Others stayed, clinging to their homes and praying that the new rulers would keep their word. Mothers whispered warnings to children. Priests held fast to sacred scrolls. Fathers silently waited behind shutters as armored men crossed their courtyards. And then, something extraordinary happened. The terror never came. When no looting occurred, people relaxed. When churches were not desecrated, bells continued to ring. When soldiers smiled while purchasing bread instead of taking it, walls of fear began to thin. This was how the new order took root, not with sermons or decrees alone, but with experiences. The experience of justice, of restraint, of moral leadership that refused the path of short-term dominance in favor of long-term legitimacy. For Abu Ubaidah, Damascus was not a trophy, it was a test, and by all measures, he passed. His leadership once again was not measured by how many cities he took, but by how he treated them once taken. He understood that laws were not written only in ink, but in decisions made at the edge of victory, decisions that people never forget. In the years that followed, Damascus would become a central node of the expanding Muslim world, the heart of the Umayyad Caliphate, the launching point for further campaigns into the north, east, and west. But in this moment, Tit's first entry into Islamic rulate experienced what few cities in war-torn regions ever do: a conversion not by sword, but by trust earned in the face of power. And it was Abu Ubaidah Khalid, Ku, not Umar, not the elite in Medina who made that trust possible. He could have taken everything. Instead, he gave order. He could have ruled through fear. Instead, he built respect. Damascus didn't just fall, it chose to stay. That was his real victory. With Damascus secured, the nature of the Syrian campaign changed. Victory was no longer about stealth, skirmishes, and single city objectives. It became about strategy, about roads, rivers, and the raw maintenance of an empire in the making. And for that, two locations stood out as essential: Fal and Emesa. Fal, known in Latin as Pella, was nestled in the Jordan Valley. Though small compared to other Syrian cities, its position gave it enormous tactical relevance. It functioned as a corridor between the southern Levant and the interior of Jordan Controlate. And you controlled the access to movement along the river, the supply routes to Palestine, and even the flanks toward Jerusalem. Emosamadr Day, Hom sat in the heart of inland Syria. It was a fortress city, older than many recognized regional states, and a crucial anchor between Aleppo, Damascus, and the coastal ports. Whoever held Emesa held the spine of Syria. Abu Ubaidah understood this. While other commanders saw battlefield victory as an end, he saw it as a transition, something that required follow-through. His leadership after the conquest phase was meticulous. Garrisons were placed across key towns. Veterans were rotated in and out of cities. Supply lines, usually the afterthought of glory-seeking generals, became his main concern. Roads were mapped, granaries distributed, and water sources protected. As winter approached, he began the strategic consolidation of his gains, establishing winter quarters for his forces and reinforcing cooperation with local populations. Taxes were not imposed at random. No commander was allowed to abuse his position. Every success had to be sustained through order and reliability. That reliability became partnership. But then came a decision that would echo through history books not for its cleverness, but for its compassion. In early 636 CE, news began to spread. Byzantine forces, bolstered by Heraclius's command, were preparing a significant retaliation. Rumors of armies coming from the north, routed through Constantinople and Anatolia, reached Abu Ubaidah. The sheer possibility of such strength forced a difficult choice: withdraw from certain towns in order to regroup safely where terrain and numbers could be managed. Among the towns temporarily evacuated were parts of the Jordan Valley and some minor fortifications in western Syria. But these towns had already paid jizya, the obligatory tax non-Muslim subjects paid under Muslim rule in exchange for protection. The officers around him expected the funds to be kept. It was, after all, wartime. But Abu Ubaidah saw it differently. He issued a simple order with a heavy implication. Refund the taxes. We took this so we could protect them, he said. If we cannot protect them, we will not take their money. Bags of jizya silver, goods, coin were carried back into the cities. Messengers announced the pact was off. The payments returned. The people were free to fend for themselves or await the return of the army. What happened next shocked even the most hardened soldiers. Across towns and villages, people wept. Some records describe priests embracing Muslim officers at the gate. Men and women followed retreating fighters out of the city, blessing them, asking for their return, praying for their success. Many had lived under Byzantine overlords for decades. Never had they received such treatment. This episode, small in number perhaps, redefined the tone of the Syrian conquest. It showed the transformative effect, not of strength, but of fairness. In an empire where power usually followed brute force, Abu Ubaidah wielded justice like a weapon that built loyalty rather than fear. The people saw the difference, and so did the Byzantine crown. For far to the north, Heraclius was watching in Constantinople. The emperor had been patient, perhaps too patient. For some time, he had believed this Arab uprising would collapse on its own. Surely, it would follow the usual pattern of broken tribal unity or internal collapse. But over recent months, cities that had withstood Persians for centuries were now run by men in dusty cloaks, quoting from a new scripture. Fortresses were changing hands, and worse, populations were not just submitting, they were cooperating. Many even preferred the new rulers. Heraclius had no choice. He began to assemble the largest Byzantine counterforce since the wars with Persia. It was not a single army. It was a multi-pronged campaign drawing on various regional pools of Armenians from the northeast, Ghassanid Arab auxiliaries from the southwest, Slavic and Anatolian forces from the heartlands of the empire. Altogether, the rumored force numbered in the tens of thousands, possibly over 100,000 when including support divisions. Some brought siege engines, others brought cavalry. All had one goal: retake Syria. But Heraclius understood that defeating a military was not enough. He needed to break morale. He employed psychological warfare letters and whispers, sent to regions temporarily under Muslim control, warning of retribution, inviting defection, promising rewards for betrayal. Traitors, passing under neutral flags, carried stories of atrocities committed by the Byzantines against towns that switched sides. They were inflated, twisted, distributed as deterrents. Despite Byzantine attempts at psychological warfare, the Muslim ranks did not fracture. If anything, Abu Ubaidah's earlier decisions, returning taxes, protecting civilians, and honoring treaties had sown a deep thread of loyalty in both his troops and the populations under his governance. Defections were few. The army watched the approaching threat not with fear, but with sobering clarity. The margins of expansion were over. Now came the battle for permanence. Muslim scouts began reporting increased Byzantine mobilization near Jordan and northern Syria. Camps swelled with foreign auxiliaries. Rivers of supply carts snaked along old Roman roads. Brigades trained on mountain passes and high plateaus. The armies of Heraclius weren't just moving, they were preparing for a siege of history. Their objective: push the Muslims back to Arabia, retake every lost town, and crush the momentum of the Islamic State before it spread further. Abu Ubaidah gathered his officers. His council was composed of experienced men: Khalid ibn al-Walid, sharp and anticipatory in war; Shurbil, steady and politically agile; Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, young but loyal. In meetings that stretched into the cold desert evenings, strategies were laid, contingencies prepared, and positions debated. Despite the looming threat, Abu Ubaidah never lost his calm. A man of faith more than volume, he believed that reliance upon Allah did not oppose deep planning, it demanded it. He was known to rise during the coldest hours before dawn, standing in prayer quietly while others slept. Those who passed his tent recalled seeing nothing but a single lantern glowing within, and the faint hum of verses being whispered. To Abu Ubaidah, command wasn't power, was a responsibility accounted for before heaven. He addressed the soldiers, not with cries of fury, but with reason. He reminded them that arrogance defeats more armies than swords ever did. He spoke seldom, but when he did, every man listened. Preparations began for the strategic convergence of forces. Multiple Muslim units began moving toward the cratered valley of the Yarmouk River, a dry basin flanked by ravines and basalt hills in what is now the modern border region between Syria and Jordan. This location wasn't an accidental choice. The terrain gave the lighter, mobile Muslim units an advantage. The open plains allowed flexibility for cavalry. And more importantly, the ridges and ravines could be used to prevent Byzantine envelopment. The plan was simple, yet deadly. Force Byzantium to engage on ground of Muslim choosing, where tactics and unit cohesion would trump numerical superiority. The transition was intense. Forces marched day and night through winter and into early spring. Supply wagons were rerouted. Local Arab tribes were contacted to assist in intelligence gathering. Posts were established at every water source along the way. Wells were capped, trails camouflaged, ambush points planned. Abu Ubaidah knew the magnitude of what was coming. Once Byzantine warbands entered the valley system, retreat would no longer be an option. It would be a confrontation that ended with the fate of the Levant. Being decided for generations, what made Abu Ubaidah's leadership unique in this moment wasn't only his tactical patience, but his belief in moral unity. He kept Khalid at the head of the battlefield command. There is no place for rivalry, no struggle for spotlight. Command structure remained clear. Khalid planned the military formations, timing, and frontline distribution. Abu Ubaidah handled logistics, troop cohesion, and diplomatic confidence, both within the army and towards surrounding non-Muslim cities. From nearby watchpoints, civilians watched the shifting tide of warsome with disbelief, others in awe. They saw organized Muslim ranks moving more like a state than a tribal force. They saw food distributed to the poor as armies passed, heard of churches whose doors remained open, and heard commanders who invoked responsibility more than vengeance. This campaign was unlike anything they had witnessed from Rome or Persia. Quiet discipline followed the Muslim camps like a second shadow. Historians later reflected that this period between the fall of Damascus and the approach to Yarmouk was one of the most concentrated examples of early Islamic leadership under pressure. The conquest, which many believed would unravel after the Prophet's death, had instead matured. Syria was no longer just military terrain. It had become a proving ground for a new way of life, a test of principles in real time. By the time the Muslim forces fully gathered near Yarmouk, the weather had shifted. Summer crept onto the horizon. The ravines hardened, the grass thinned, and across the plains from every distant ridge, scouts began reporting the same sight. The Byzantine army was moving. Thousands upon thousands. Banners rising with golden crosses. Mixed languages carried over their camps: Greek, Armenian, Syriac. Latin-hardened soldiers of a fading empire marching south for one last stand. Abu Ubaidah stood over a map, tracing it with a stick as his officers watched. He didn't make grand declarations, nor did he quote verses as performance. He looked up, nodded once, and said, "We begin." It was no longer a war of movement. It was a war of decision. The Islamic conquest had reached the edge of empire, and on the valley floor of Yarmouk, the storm had finally gathered. The valley of Yarmouk was a battlefield unlike any the early Muslim forces had ever seen. Not an open plain, nor dense terrain. It was a land of extreme natural amphitheater carved by wind and time, shaped by high basalt cliffs and deep ravines that sliced through the earth like surgical scars. The Yarmouk River itself lay beneath. The southern edge of this terrain, twisting in steep gorges, forming a deadly boundary that limited retreat. To the north and east, the plateau opened into undulating, dusty plains. Ideal for mounted warfare, but treacherous under the wrong. Conditions here, geography became destiny. The Muslims positioned themselves along the southeastern side of the field, stronger tactical location with elevated rear ground and defensive perimeters. The Byzantines, on the other hand, stretched out across the northern flank and central basin. Their numbers vast, their banners endless. The Christians' assemblies outnumbered the Muslims many times over. A patchwork force led by the experienced Armenian general Vahan, a man sent by Emperor Heraclius himself. Under Vahan's command were 1,000 threads, regular Byzantine legions, Greek heavy infantry, Armenian cavalry, Christian Arab auxiliaries, Slavic foot soldiers. A multinational, multi-theological host bound only by fear of loss and faint memory of imperial greatness. Their strength in numbers was undeniable, but they suffered under the weight of fractured loyalty and unsteady coordination. Many of the local Christian Arabs resented Roman taxation and distant imperium. Others questioned leadership priorities and long-term support from the capital. The Muslims were fewer, but overwhelmingly unified. Each unit moved like an organ of the same body. At their top stood Abu Ubaidah, the overall commander. Calm, unshaken, and spiritually rooted, He focused not on tactics alone, but on morale, unity, and the larger direction of the force. But when it came to the maneuvers of battle, Abu Ubaidah recognized something critical. The battlefield would move too fast for centralized, slow-moving commands, and so he leaned on brilliance. Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid was placed in active charge of the Mobile Guard, a specialized cavalry unit that operated like a scalpel-swift, deadly, precise. It would be the Guard's role to reinforce weakened lines, split formations, overwhelm retreating units, and apply surgical pressure when and where needed. The rest of the army was divided into well-organized divisions, each led by trusted commanders. Dirar ibn al-Azwar, fierce and unrelenting, led a seasoned infantry group. Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, formerly an enemy of Islam, now turned martyr, in waiting, led with reckless courage. Shurah Bil and Yazid, veteran commanders of previous campaigns, held the flanks. The battle would not be a single, decisive hour. It would last several unforgiving days. What followed was a rhythmic, multi-day clashed advances and retreats, probes and ambushes, defenses hardened in the heat, counterattacks carried under the veil of dust and smoke. Each day began with Byzantine volleys, attempts to break the Muslim front lines through brute force. Waves of infantry pressed forward, followed by cavalry charges rolling like thunder across the plains. The Muslims, deeply outnumbered, absorbed the impact, shifted positions strategically, and fired back not with chaos, but with choreographed survival. The Mobile Guard, commanded by Khalid, became the silent hammer. When a flank buckled, it appeared. When enemy cavalry sought a breakthrough, it struck. When cracks opened, it sliced through them like ink through paper. Behind the lines, the most unexpected force of all emerged. The Muslim women, wives, sisters, and daughters had joined their families on this campaign, not as bystanders, but as support and voice. When some men faltered in fear under imperial cavalry assaults, women like Hind bint Utbah and others hurled encouragement and, at times, even stones and swords at retreating fighters, forcing them back into the fray. Their presence became a moral anchor. They weren't there to spectate. They were ready to die with the men if the lines were breached. As the days wore on, exhaustion gripped both sides. Supply lines stretched thin. Water became precious. Byzantine morale dipped. Each Muslim commander gave impassioned speeches before dawn, calling their men not to glory, but to duty, a legacy for their children, and a delivery against injustice. One such speech by Ikrimah called his unit to swear an oath of death, a final stand, regardless of outcome. Many did, and many of them would never return from the field. Then came the decisive moment, what later sources would immortalize as the turning of the wind. According to reports, a strong eastern wind suddenly swept across the field on the final day. Dust and sand slammed into the faces of the Byzantine forces, reducing visibility, blinding horses, and scattering formations. The Muslims, positioned tactically with their backs to the wind, capitalized instantly. Khalid's Mobile Guard split the field, while the Byzantine cavalry tried to maneuver out. The confined terrain cornered them. Ravines, once offering a natural barrier, now became death traps. Horses slipped into the channels. Men fell into sharp gorges. Cohesion collapsed. Veteran Roman units suddenly found themselves encircled. Several Ghassanid units defected or fled. Lines folded, and panic, subtle at first, became widespread. Khalid drove forward with precision, coordinating flanks to press from three sides. Confusion turned into collapse. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this chaos was Abu Ubaidah's strict enforcement of discipline as the collapse unfolded. Even as Byzantine troops fled, he instructed Muslim units to pursue only as needed. Civilians were not to be harmed. Churches along the riverside were to be untouched. Prisoners were to be separated from combatants. There was to be no looting without permission, no revenge masquerading as justice, even after 5 days of unrelenting combat. Amid the fog of adrenaline and grief, his orders were obeyed. The battlefield, once alive with clashing steel and screams of charge, slowly turned silent. The ground was marked by history-now-rooted trails from cavalry charges, shattered shields embedded in earth, and cloth flags torn between life and surrender. The Byzantine army was broken. Vahan, their general, either struck down in combat, or lost among the fleeing masses, vanished from record after that day. Some of the fleeing remnants tried to escape north, seeking refuge in abandoned forts or sympathetic towns, but the geography betrayed them. The sharp ravines, the blocked river routes, and the relentless press of Muslim cavalry under Khalid's final coordinated charges made withdrawal nearly impossible in the span of 5 days. The military balance of the region was irreversibly tilted. The Byzantines had not just suffered a defeat, they had lost Syria. Not every town had yet fallen, but the momentum could no longer be reversed. Heraclius, once the master of the eastern Mediterranean, was now left clinging to its edges. As reports flooded into Constantinople, he is said to have wept aloud, bitterly proclaiming, "Farewell, O Syria, ... Farewell, you land of beauty." He knew what all emperors fear. Some doors, once shut, never reopen. But victory did not bring celebration to everyone. In the Muslim camp, there was mourning alongside triumph. Men of valor had fallen among them, the brave-hearted Ikrimah, the son of one of Islam's fiercest enemies, now a martyr in its greatest battle. Others, wounded and unable to be moved, passed away on the field over the following days. Fighters embraced quietly, bandaged each other's arms, and gave thanks as best they could for survival, for victory, and for the end of a trial that tested them beyond measure. Amidst the scattered tents and makeshift medical stations, Abu Ubaidah walked alone. He did not stand before the men to bask in praise. He did not command a victory parade or have his name carved into shields. Instead, he left the camp, found a spot away from the noise and wounded, and placed his forehead on the ground. He remained in sujud, that posture of complete surrender, for what observers later described as a long, still silence. There were no trumpets, no trophies in his hand, just tears, dust, sweat, and a whispered prayer. Because to Abu Ubaidah, this was not glory. It was responsibility fulfilled. Lives lost under his command. Cities won that must now be governed with mercy. Territory claimed in the name of a faith that he knew would only last if character outlived conquest. When Abu Ubaidah returned to the camp, he began issuing orders not for cities to be sacked, but for wounded enemy prisoners to be treated, for non-combatants to be relocated safely, and for communication to be re-established with the recently subdued towns in the region. Victory was never the end goal. Stability was order, trust, dignity. In the towns near Yarmouk, news of the battle moved faster than horses. Byzantine patrols did not return. Governors fled in panic. Many local leaders, realizing the full collapse of imperial protection, sent delegations to Abu Ubaidah before fighting even reached their gates. This accelerated a cascade. Emesa Kinasrine, Aleppo, Hama, and more began to either negotiate terms or fall into Muslim hands without resistance in the coming weeks. The soldiers now saw the deep cost and purpose of the campaign. For them, Yarmouk was where the question ended. Would this new faith survive, or would it be crushed by the empires of old? It was no longer a movement confined to Arabia. It was a new civilizational force rooted in law, faith, and a sense of moral accountability, rarely seen in post-war contexts. Yarmouk proved that empires did not fall by numbers alone. They fell when the people stopped believing in them, and when the new bearers of power showed a better way. But while the map shifted, while commanders like Khalid and Shurabil prepared new routes northward, Abu Ubaidah remained unchanged. He still refused camouflage of luxury, still lived with the same patched cloak, drank from the same beaten cup, and preferred the company of the poor over nobles. His tent was filled not with trophies or scrolls, but with maps, names of fallen soldiers, and Quranic verses written in fading ink. He believed in building not with fire, but with faith. Even Khalid, as daring as he was, deferred to Abu Ubaidah at this point without hesitation. He understood the rare balance of force and virtue that the broader campaign rested upon. The soldiers followed Abu Ubaidah, not out of fear, but because in him they saw the very ideals that brought them to battle honor to God, service to people, and truth without vanity. The Battle of Yarmouk did not just redraw borders on the ground. It etched moral direction into the leadership tradition of the early Islamic conquests. Its memory persisted not in mere strategy books, but in the hearts of those who lived to tell it. From that moment onward, Syria would never be the same. The land of prophets, poets, civilizations, and crusades had now entered a new era, one carried not just by the sword, but by the integrity of men like Abu Ubaidah, who knew when to fight and, more importantly, how to handle victory. And so, under the Syrian sun, on earth still carrying the weight of 5 days of fury, a man knelt quietly, in dust, seeking no crown, blindly forgiveness. For war, no matter its purpose, still left his heart heavy. Where the wind once turned, empires collapsed, but from that turn, a new order had just begun to rise. In the wake of Yarmouk, the map unraveled faster than most anticipated. Resistance faded like fog under sun. The sword had opened the gates, but it was something else that kept them open. What happened next was not the thunder of continued war, but the quiet, strategic unfolding of a new system, a new statecraft, a rhythm of rolling capitulations not due to force alone, but to the manner in which force had been restrained, as survivors and stragglers of the Byzantine defeat fled north and west. The towns between the battlefields and the Byzantines' last coastal holdouts began falling, all with barely a fight. Hamzi Mesa, Hama Kinisreen, and multiple towns along the Orontes River offered to negotiate rather than resist. While many of these cities had the capacity to sustain sieges or retreat into their fortified cores, they chose a different path because the rumors from Damascus and the Jordan Valley told of an army that did not break what it conquered, but lived beside it. Each surrender came with treaties, handwritten agreements signed by Muslim commanders, often by Abu Ubaidah himself, that specified exact protections. Churches were to remain intact, land and livestock untouched, non-Muslim citizens free to worship and maintain their institutions. Chief among these terms were the formalizations of two key systems, jizya and kharaj. Jizya, a poll tax levied on non-Muslims, was not merely a financial tool, it was a public endorsement of protection. Those who paid it were guaranteed full civil security, exemption from military drafts, and freedom to live by their religious laws. Kharaj, the land tax levied on agricultural zones, replaced the harsher Roman taxation, calculated with local input tied to the actual yield of crops rather than flat oppressive quotas. In some regions, farmers openly accepted the Muslim system as kinder and more consistent than the Byzantine administration. But what sealed trust wasn't just policy, it was personality. Abu Ubaidah's administration reflected his soul. He avoided building walls around the houses of leaders. He refused to hire dozens of personal guards. His open court policy, where citizens, Christians, Jews, or Muslims could seek justice without being filtered through secretaries and judges, became almost legendary. In the city of Homs, witnesses later remarked that petty disputes were settled faster under Muslim rule than they had ever been under imperial oversight. He walked the streets, not on horseback, behind banners, but on foot like any citizens. Marketplaces knew his face. Merchants greeted him without fear of hidden taxes or sudden confiscations. One city governor built for himself to lavish a palace. Abu Ubaidah ordered it shut down until the funds could be audited and verified as lawful. His harshest punishments weren't reserved for enemies. They were for those within who betrayed public trust. Garrisons were established after conquest, but never in a way that smothered a people. The new Muslim military presence would usually settle on the outskirts of major towns, avoiding billeting in homes, respecting private property, and setting up structured encampments that could defend yet remain separate where possible. Cities were not militarized into silence, they were preserved to breathe as the dust of war began to settle. Culture began to move. The Greek and Syriac scribes who worked in monasteries and public schools shifted their translational skills towards contracts and communication with the new Arabic-speaking leadership. Syriac bishops, some of whom had lived under pressure from Byzantine orthodoxy, found the Muslims more flexible with religions outside Islam's fold than the empire had been. With Christian sectarianism, many Syriac communities, historically persecuted by the Constantinople-lined Chalcedonian Church, now found space to negotiate liturgical freedom's interrupted processions, upkeep of monastery lands, and recognition of ecclesiastical titles. Under Muslim protection, Arabic, once limited to the caravans and marketplaces of the Arabian heartland, began to ride the roads of Syria. It mingled with Greek, Aramaic, and Coptic. It appeared on receipts, on contracts, and on road markers. It emerged not as a conqueror's tongue, but as a shared language, born of diplomatic necessity and mutual trade. Markets adjusted. Trade routes remained intact, restoring supply lines to ports like Tripoli, Antioch, and Tyre. Merchant families, who had feared war would disrupt their generational businesses, found instead that they could simply reroute commercial ties through the new administration and continue operations uninterrupted. In fact, the soft taxes and decentralized oversight often made their profits better. But the most surprising shift came not through money or language, but through admiration. The people who had feared fire and ruin now told stories of the men who ruled them, the conqueror who wrote receipts, the general who carried his own water, the governor who gave back taxes when not earned, the man with no palace, no guards, and no walls around his home. These weren't formal policies, they were habits of the soul, behaviors, not slogans. And they reshaped Syria more than sword or treaty ever could. When Abu Ubaidah visited towns newly brought under Muslim rule, he didn't arrive with fanfare or imperial display. He carried his patched cloak, his water skin, and the same saddle that had served as his pillow during the campaigns. These small tokens, seemingly insignificant, became symbols that resonated with Syrians who had long been accustomed to distant emperors and high walls. Here was a man leading the new superpower in the region yet whose home resembled that of a soldier, not a king. In Knesset, when asked where the new governor's residence should be built, Abu Ubaidah quietly declined any personal estate. A man in charge of others, he said, must live among them. A simple structure was raised near the central masjid instead, open during daylight and never locked at night. There was no throne, only a cushion and a few scrolls. When disputes arose, his court heard them swiftly. When mistakes were made by tax collectors or soldiers, his correction was swift and public. This kind of administration impressed even those who did not share his faith. For the Christian and Jewish citizens of Syria, what mattered most after the wars was whether their daily lives would be disrupted, whether their traditions would be respected, and whether fairness could be accessed without needing bribes or imperial connections. Under Abu Ubaidah's leadership, the answer was yes. Records reveal no mass disarmament of civilian populations, no destruction of sacred sites, and no curfews. People were left to worship, work, farm, and trade. One church leader, writing decades later in reference to Abu Ubaidah's generation, stated bluntly that the Arabs left us more free to be Christians than Rome ever did. Some monastic communities even forged informal partnerships with Muslim tax registrars and military officers, functioning as local administrators who knew the terrain and population density of their districts better than foreign appointed governors ever had. The transition from empire to Amma was not merely military. It was administrative, cultural, and emotional. Muslims were not just arriving as soldiers, they came bearing a new contract of civilization. And that contract, in Syria, was being written not by fear or gold, but through the example of people. Like Abu Ubaidah, who refused to elevate themselves above the people, even Muslim soldiers, at times were surprised at his humility. One story tells of a delegation from the Caliph visiting Syria and being unable to locate Abu Ubaidah for hours, only to find him eventually sharing bread with a group of Christian farmers near Hama, seated on the ground offering advice about rebuilding a canal damaged during clashes. He had offered them some of the garrison's timber stores and labor not as imperial largesse, but as part of the promise, protection, support, and coexistence. Of course, not all was peaceful. Border raids from Heraclius's last strongholds in Anatolia still occurred. Isolated Byzantine units tried small ambushes along the Orontes and in the northern hills. But overwhelmingly, the people of Syria no longer saw the Byzantines as their loyal guardians, but as distant rulers who had long forgotten the realities of the land. The empire's banners represented taxes, conscription, and theological oppression. The arrival of the Muslims and of leaders like Abu Ubaidah fell teeth. Not to all, then to a large number, like a correction, not an invasion. Even those who did not welcome the conquest saw its difference. Unlike other conquerors, the Muslims didn't uproot everything. They weaved themselves in. Roads were maintained, postal routes restored, water channels repaired. Mosques were built. Yes, but beside churches, not over them. Market stalls sold both dates and wine, meats slaughtered differently, cloths from Yemen and icons from Antioch. A new world was forming, one not of erasure, but of layered coexistence. All this was possible because, from the very top, power was rarely abused. We often study conquest as a story of how land is taken. But in Syria, under Abu Ubaidah, the more important story became how land was kept. How a people, newly introduced to a foreign force, chose to remain with them, chose to deal and trade, speak and serve. Pay tax and expect protection, which leads to the guiding question of this chapter. Can a conquest be less about taking and more about keeping trust? Abu Ubaidah lived that possibility. He turned victory into responsibility, law into character, and conquest into coexistence. Where glory tempted ego, he walked away. Where entitlement crept in, he shut it down. Where war could have justified cruelty, he condemned it. His legacy in Syria was not just written in treaties or troop movements, but in the lived memory of ordinary people. The shepherd who kept his flock, the priest who kept his sermons, the vendor who kept his stall. He did not inscribe history on stone. He wrote it in the quiet dignity of how people lived after the battles were over. The fall of Damascus and the crushing victory at Yarmouk did not just collapse Byzantine lines, altered perception itself. City after city came under Muslim control, each treated with consistency, with order, and with respect. But one city remained apart. A place not only of Roman administration, but of global spiritual legacy, Aelia, as the Byzantines called it. Jerusalem, as it would echo through centuries. It had been under Christian Byzantine control for 3 centuries. Before that, Roman. Before that, Jewish Hasmonean and Seleucid, and, deeper still, memories from the time of Solomon and David lingered. In its stones like whispers in the wind. Its people were a tapestry. Orthodox Christians, Monophysites, Jews, Samaritans, pilgrims from Africa, Armenia, Persia. And now, after the fate of empire had shifted, they awaited what seemed inevitable. But Jerusalem did not fall to the sword. Instead, the Patriarch Sophronius, the city's Christian leader, made a unique demand. He would only surrender the city to the Caliph himself, not to generals, not to emissaries, to the leader of the Muslims in person. A demand that came not from arrogance, but from the gravity of what Jerusalem represented. Abu Ubaidah respected the request and granted it. Word was sent to Medina, where Umar ibn al-Khattab reigned. The letter was direct, not dramatic, but its implications were massive. For a leader who spent his days walking among the poor and sleeping without guards, a journey into the heart of a newly conquered land could change how he and the caliphate were perceived. Yet, when he read Abu Ubaidah's words, Umar didn't hesitate. He packed his things. He walked with only one servant, one riding camel, and no military entourage. Umar set out from the Arabian heartland not as a ruler draped in gold, but as a shepherd on a mission of accountability. He and the servant took turns riding the camel. Some narrations say at certain points the servant rode while Umar walked. When asked why, Umar smiled and said, "The time is his." Dust clung to his face. His cloak was patched like a farmer's apron. His hands bore the rough marks of labor. And when he finally reached Syria, his simple attire caused whispers among commanders and soldiers used to seeing generals in embellished armor. The contrast between his power and appearance couldn't have been more striking. When he neared Jerusalem, Abu Ubaidah came forward to greet him cleaner, more polished, dressed with regional appropriateness out of respect for the city he helped bring into the fold. Seeing Umar's raw garments and dusty exhaustion, Abu Ubaidah gently suggested he change into something more fitting for the occasion. After all, representatives of the ancient city and even Roman onlookers might be watching. Umar stopped walking and looked him in the eye. His reply would become legendary. "We are a people whom God honored through Islam. If we seek honor elsewhere, we will be humiliated." That single line became a cornerstone of the Islamic conception of leadership in the early caliphate. Honor does not come from clothing, lavishness, or spectacle. It comes from integrity, from how one walks into a city not to claim it, but to keep it safe. And so, the two men walked not as conquerors, but as guardians toward the city that had seen prophets, kings, crucifixions, invasions, crusades, exile, and resurrection. The city gates opened, not a bough was broken, not a storm was launched. Sophronius led a peaceful delegation to hand over the keys. A Christian archbishop invited a Muslim caliph to take responsibility for the city's protection, not just of Muslims, but of everyone within. In this moment, the two civilizations, the old and the new, faced one another, not with swords drawn, but scrolls opened. Are accepted the surrender with dignity. No plunder was allowed. No persecution was carried out. No churches destroyed. Perhaps most important, a document was drafted, what would be remembered as the Ad Olamar, or Umar's Covenant. In it were clear protections, the safety of Christian persons, property, and churches was to be preserved. The cross would not be removed. No. One would be forced to convert. No priests would be harmed or restricted in worship. Religious rituals were protected, and the rights of all peoples in Aelia were guaranteed under Islamic legal authority. This document, whether recorded immediately or memorialized in full form later, captured something that transcended politics. It was a civic philosophy in legal form. It was a vision of governance designed not for a moment, but for longevity. And it gave Jerusalem, for all its fragility, a breath of stability it had not known in years. Once the covenant was established, Umar began retrieving the past, not by revising it, but by protecting it. He toured the city, observing its roads, its communities, its ruins, and its sacred sites. He did not issue proclamations declaring superiority or dominance. Instead, he listened. He asked questions. His presence, grounded and simple, reminded the citizens of Aelia that the new Islamic rule did not mean the end of their way of life. It meant its respectful continuation. But then came a moment that would define not just Umar's visit, but how Islam would approach sacred spaces that were not its own. Patriarch Sophronius invited Umar to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the holiest Christian sites in the world. It would have been a historic scene, the Caliph of expanding Islam praying within Christianity's spiritual heart. No one would have stopped him. And yet, Umar politely refused. He stepped outside. Later, he explained why. If I had prayed here, he said, perhaps future generations would claim this church as a mosque, and I would not be the cause of injustice. So instead, he performed his prayer outside in the courtyard. On bare stone, it was a decision born of restraint, of seeing far ahead into how memory, power, and symbolism would shape contested spaces. Umar's choice drew a line between reverence and rule. K protected their place of worship not only physically, but symbolically, ensuring that it would never be misconstrued as having changed hands through piety misplaced. Later, a masjid, Umar, would be built at that spot in the courtyard, near but not replacing the church. Two sacred spaces side by side, two truths sharing the skyline. And with that, Jerusalem was preserved, its texture, complexity, and spiritual diversity kept intact by those strong enough to let others be. All this occurred with Abu Ubaidah watching not from a throne, not with trumpets, but from the quiet position he always took, right beside history. Without trying to be the center of it, he smiled as the keys passed hands without violence. He listened as promises were made without coercion. He stood silently as Umar set precedents not just for Jerusalem, but for how Muslims would treat holy cities for centuries to come, not as spoils, but as trusts. The crowd saw two men, unlike anything imperial officials had shown them. There was no gold on their robes, no chariots, no royal processions. Just faith embodied by simplicity. One of them had led the armies that broke Byzantium's control of Syria, but still walked among the people with no guard. The other had refused to sit where others knelt instead, kneeling where it would protect their place to stand. Jerusalem, so often the site of fire and conquest, received its transition without violence because of Temena Caliph, who feared God more than crowns, and a general who embodied trust more than command. Together, they demonstrated that true power does not scream. It arrives in humility. It arrives walking not on horseback, not in armor, but on foot, beside a friend, guided by principle. For the city residents, it set a tone that would linger. For the Muslims under their command, it became a model of leadership rooted in restraint. And for the history books, it offered a rare vision of how transitions of power can be written not in blood, but in scrolls, smiles, and simple words. Later, when Jerusalem would be contested again by empires, crusades, caliphs, or statespeople would look back to this quiet entry, this walk of two men, as a golden standard of what conquest can look like when it becomes responsibility rather than revenge. As the gates of the city closed behind them that evening and the streets calmed beneath the glow of oil lamps, Abu Ubaidah looked back, once his eyes scanning the walls he would never seek to own. He had led an army to the doorstep of history, but it was his character, again. That would be the force people remembered. Honor was never in the taking, it was always in how one chose to arrive. Leadership often comes dressed in robes, behind walls, with guards posted at every corner. But in the lands of Syria, in a capital freshly claimed by changing tides, one of the most powerful men in the Islamic world lived hidden under the cloak of modesty, nearly impossible to distinguish from the soldiers he commanded or the farmers. He spoke too, long after battles were over and treaties signed, when the dust had settled and governance became harder than conquest. It was Abu Ubaidah who stood quietly at the center, no longer general, not quite governor, but something in between. A moral compass living among the complications of power. It was then that Umar came to Syria. The Caliph made his journey not to inspect cities, but to check on hearts. News had reached Medina of vast tributes flowing in, cities prospering, and commanders leading with ease. But Umar, wary of worldly comforts, feared that hearts, once pure, might be softening under gold and praise. So when Umar reached the military headquarters in Syria, he did not visit palaces or sit among fine cushions. He asked for one man, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. When the two companions finally met, the moment was heavy with years of shared history, wars fought, promises fulfilled, prayers whispered under stars. Abu Ubaidah embraced him like a brother, like the only other man alive who bore the same weight of stewardship for an entire civilization. Umar asked to see his home at first. Abu Ubaidah hesitated, but eventually he led the Caliph there, not through gates or a courtyard, but through a simple wooden frame covered with woven fabric. Inside the house were a water skin, a saddlebag, a few bowls, and a mat. That was all. No furniture, no jewelry, no guards, not even a door that locked. Umar stood still, overwhelmed. Then he wept, and as tears flowed down the cheeks of a man entrusted with the leadership of an entire world, he spoke words that would be remembered for generations. The world has changed us all. Abu Ubaidah, except you. It was not praise. It was reverence. This moment became the unseen halo around Abu Ubaidah's legacy. Not because he lacked wealth, but because he had refused it when it was within reach. Yet his humility never obstructed his duty, while he lived with ascetic simplicity. Abu Ubaidah helped oversee one of the largest civilian and military transitions in the early Muslim empire. He wasn't merely a figurehead. He was deeply involved in systems that would outlive him. Take, for example, the Register Czar Diwans. Under Umar's administration, aided by field reports from commanders like Abu Ubaidah, detailed records were established for payments, pensions, rations, tax collection, and military rotation. And it was Abu Ubaidah who helped shape their moral framework on the frontier, ensuring that these weren't just dry numbers on scrolls, but tools of justice. He ordered regular rations for widows, not just of Muslim soldiers, but even for widows of enemy combatants, a policy almost unheard of in post-war societies. Orphans were assigned stipends based on need, not status. Soldiers injured in battle received life pensions, with some even assigned young aides paid through the state, fund to assist them in daily tasks. The logic was simple. If the state asked for sacrifice, it owed care in return. He also helped regulate military positioning. Abu Ubaidah made sure that troops wintered outside populated urban areas, ensuring soldiers would not sponge off the local population or oppress civilians through informal occupation. Garrisons had their own markets, rules, and commanders. Discipline was mandatory, not flexible. Soldiers who harassed citizens, withheld payments, or abused power were punished swiftly, often publicly. To set precedent, trade routes remained sacred. Patrols ensured caravans moved unharmed from Damascus to Aleppo, from Homs to the sea. Bandits, regardless of faith or origin, were tracked and eliminated. Merchants began petitioning to be registered under Muslim protection, voluntarily paying taxes in exchange for safety and legal infrastructure. And yet, it was not always seamless. Not every decision came without resistance. Even in an army led by righteousness, friction surfaced. Some younger officers, their hearts still hot from the fires of recent battles, wished to push harder, expand further, take risks, and raise the banners of conquest beyond the current front. They saw the remaining Byzantine territories to the north and west as fragile, vulnerable, waiting to fall if only pressure were applied. But Abu Ubaidah did not rush. He knew that victory built too fast risked cracking beneath its own weight. When younger men urged him to press deeper into Anatolia, he wrote to Umar in Medina, seeking clarification should they continue. Should they risk thinning out the core garrisons? The Caliph's reply was clear: consolidate first. Make justice so deep in these lands that no man, woman, or child fears your banner, not even when it is raised high. Abu Ubaidah accepted this slower path not because he lacked ambition, but because he feared ambition without ethics. He knew how power warped the minds of men who no longer heard no. He enforced discipline even among senior commanders. At times, camps grew tense. Letters went back and forth. But ultimately, his firmness was rarely questioned long. Then there were the Byzantine remnants, clusters of resistance hiding in mountain towns, fortified monasteries, and hilltop bastions. They would snipe from afar, block supply lines, and circle villages that had already accepted Muslim administration. Abu Ubaidah dispatched cavalry units sparingly, and he always instructed his generals: no towns punished for the actions of rogues, no communities judged for the crimes of a few. That restraint often frustrated those who wished for swifter vengeance. But in time, it paid its own kind of dividend. Trust. Nearby towns began reporting these rogue bands to Muslim authorities. Villagers who once feared the conquerors now relied on them to stop chaos. Amidst all this, Abu Ubaidah rarely slept more than a few hours at night. He aged rapidly. Witnesses noted that his clothes were always loose, his face gaunt. The same man who marched through the desert with Khalid, who calmed civil tremors and accepted Jerusalem's keys, now seemed thinner with every passing month. Power did not intoxicate him. It wore him down. He never complained publicly. But late at night, he would sit before candles, writing long scrolls reports to Umar, rulings on local village disputes, adjustments to rations based on barley harvests. And sometimes, he wrote nothing at all, just sat silently with the faint hum of Quranic verses slipping from his lips as the camp slept. These were the personal costs of unglamorous goodness. To be the governor without walls, the conqueror without pride, the warrior without leisure. Abu Ubaidah may have lived among cities swelling with new wealth and security, but he never let it touch him. His meals remained modest. His boots remained worn. His heart remained heavy, not from guilt, but from constant responsibility. Where others wrote history by winning battles, Abu Ubaidah wrote it by keeping promises after victory. People knew if a tax was unjust, he would change it himself. If a soldier violated civilian rights, he would correct it personally. If an orphan cried, he would listen. He trusted few messengers, delayed nothing that could be done today. He acted as if God would call him to account in every hour. But there is a price to living like that. One night, when a companion suggested he offer himself some rest, he simply replied, "If the people sleep safely, how can I justify sleeping longer than them?" His legacy was not written in silver coin or military triumph alone. It was carved slowly into the behavior of thousands, into how judges ruled after him, how governors styled their homes, how soldiers handled prisoners, how courts, both Muslim and Christian, cited his balanced hand. Here was a man so trusted by the caliph that he could overrule generals, so loved by the people that markets would fall silent when he passed. And yet, he never once built a fortress or renamed a city after himself. In the end, Abu Ubaidah's power came not from fear, but from love, a devotion born not of showmanship, but sacrifice. His victories were not thunderous. They were quiet, steady, enduring. He embodied the core truth that shaped the Rashidun era. Real power is not what you can take, it's what you willingly refuse. In the year 639 CE, a new enemy arrived in the land Abu Ubaidah had kept so carefully intact. With swords or strategy, but in the silence of breath and the contagion of touch. It came not in legions, but in waves, unseen and untamed. The Plague of Amwas, named after a small village near Emmaus, Kin, in Palestine, descended with ferocity. No defenses held against it. Cities shuddered. Camps darkened. Soldiers and civilians, alike, regardless of title or tribe, felt its reach. It struck the lungs, drained the body, and took the strongest men in days. There was no battlefield retreat, no cavalry maneuver, only patience and funerals. Abu Ubaidah, whose hands had signed treaties, drawn lines of defense, and settled quarrels, now watched the very army he helped build begin to wither. Thousands fell. Companions of the Prophet, veterans of Badr, pillars of administration, and families alike. Among the dead was one of the most revered minds in early Islam, Ibn Jabal, the scholar warrior known for his depth of understanding and calm authority. And still, the deaths continued. From Medina, news of the outbreak reached Caliph Umar. He immediately set out to assess the situation in person. But as he reached the border of plague-afflicted Syria, His companions warned him of the risks, not only to health, but to leadership. If the caliph entered the infected zones and died, the Muslim world could be thrust into political chaos. He paused. He listened. And then he turned back. When some criticized his decision, pointing out that avoiding the plague seemed like fleeing the will of God, Umar replied with a line for the ages: "We flee from one decree of God to another." In that moment, Umar delivered a theology of pragmatic faith. To trust in God did not mean walking blindly into harm. To believe in fate did not require discarding caution. This balance between tawakkal, trust in God, and tadbir, reasonable planning, became a cornerstone of Islamic thought. It would guide not only how Muslims responded to illness, but how they viewed governance, war, and responsibility. Still, Umar's heart was burdened. He sent a personal message to Abu Ubaidah with one request: leave Syria, come to Medina. Let the burden fall lightly on someone else, even for a while. Abu Ubaidah read the letter. He understood its emotion, its urgency, and yet he refused, not harshly, not with obstinance, but with a gentleness that had defined him from the beginning. "How can I abandon the army?" he wrote. "While it suffers this trial, I will not leave these people to die alone. Not while I am capable of standing among them." And so he remained as the plague crept further. Abu Ubaidah began planning for the end. Quietly, diligently, not seeking pity or praise. He gathered his most trusted officers and gave them tiers of succession. If he fell, one would lead, and if that one fell, the next. Decision by decision, he ensured leadership would outlive individuals, that the community would not fracture because of grief. Finally, when he felt the sickness creeping into his own body, he gathered the remaining soldiers and townspeople and delivered one last sermon. His voice was thin, but the words were clear. He spoke of patience in trial, of humility, of the life he had lived, not seeking anything from the world, and thus having nothing left to lose. He urged his people to seek provision in simplicity, protection in justice, and meaning in service. He did not name his deeds. He only reminded them of what mattered: to stand firm even if alone, to love Allah, and to hold on to truth with the final strength of a fading breath. Then he lay down not on a couch or in any military lodge, but on the ground, using his saddle as a pillow, as he had done on countless nights in campaigns from Hijaz to Syria. No palace, no monument, no final command. Just stillness. There were no crowds at his deathbed. Most of his companions had already succumbed or were quarantined. The man who governed one of the greatest conquests in Islamic history passed away unnoticed by the world outside, but wept for by every soul within it. He was buried in the Jordan Valley, near the town of Amwas itself, among those he had chosen not to leave behind. No grand tomb was erected, not from lack of resources, but by design. He had asked for no honor but that which came after death from the memories of the just in the wake of the plague. Syria staggered, but it did not collapse. The loss of Abu Ubaidah and so many others left the army grieving, the administration stretched, and the people frightened. It was a time when chaos could have crept back in across the borders. But foresight, structure, and the ethical code established during the years of Abu Ubaidah's governance held the line. The system didn't depend solely on his presence. It had been instilled deep enough to function without him in the initial days after his death. It was Amr ibn al, as strategist commander, and a man of resourceful thinking who took control of emergency measures. He issued strict instructions to move the population away from the infected valley, isolating towns, suspending troop movements, and limiting contact. Some criticized his bold deviations, but his gamble worked. New infections slowed. Roads cleared. Recovery began. And soon after, the surviving structure of the state reasserted itself. People began to speak not only of survival, but of continuity. The Diwan records were preserved. Trade resumed under restrictions. Civil courts reopened. Farmers returned to their fields, cautiously but with hope. The conquest had not only brought control over new lands, it had instituted a way of handling crisis. Not with tyranny, not with panic, but with slow, deliberate resolve, Assyria healed. So too did the narratives. The people who lived through Abu Ubaidah's era did not see him as a warlord, nor just a general. They saw him as a guardian, someone who ruled not from compulsion, but from conscience. His name became a moral reference point among both soldiers and civilians. When new administrators argued over how to allocate food, or how to treat rebels, or how to conduct diplomacy, elders would say, Abu Ubaidah would have done it like this, and the debate would shift. Even Caliph Umarhu had relied on Abu Ubaidah, as his steadiness at the edge of empire felt the blow more deeply than most. He reflected on him often, sometimes in private gatherings, sometimes in public. Perhaps the most piercing of his statements came later in his reign, when his own succession became an open question. Among companions, Umar said, "If Abu Ubaidah were alive, I would have appointed him my successor." No other general, not even Khalid, received such a statement from the man known for his obsession with justice and aversion to dynastic rule. It was not said lightly. Umar saw in Abu Ubaidah something that transcended talenta purity that power could not corrupt. Today, historians examining the early Islamic expansions often classify its great leaders into archetypes. Khalid ibn al-Walid, embodiment of force and fearless maneuvering. Umar ibn al-Khattab, the administrator, uncompromising, analytical, nerve-centering the early caliphate. And then Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, the quiet light, the man who enabled others to lead by removing ego from every decision. Conscience in armor. What we learn from Abu Ubaidah's life is that conquest without justice is hollow, that mercy in moments of power is not weakness, but wisdom. That leadership is not bold words, is the ability to absorb hardship without complaint, to carry burdens when no one applauds you, and to leave behind a place better than you found it, not for memory, but for God. His legacy outlived empires, later dynasties Umayyads. Abbasids, Ottomans would struggle with the weight of this early standard. Some tried to revive it, others fell in comparison. But the name Abu Ubaidah remained, inscribed in Islamic memory, not for what he built, but for what he preserved: dignity, structure, and faith in times when even the most righteous could stumble. And so we come to the final image. Not a monument, not a fortress, not a legacy of buildings or bloodlines, just a saddle used as a pillow, the same one he slept on during campaigns, the same he sat upon while refusing power, the same at his side when plague made its final call. Beneath a vast Syrian sky, starless on some nights, blinding with sunlight by daylight, that simple piece of leather. And beside it, a man whose hands once steered armies, but never grasped for more than what he needed. He didn't die in the thrill of battle. He didn't live under marble columns. He died as he lived in trust, in dignity, in silence. A man who proved that empires are not just moved by swords, but also by the hands of those who refuse to close around them.